Good morning, everybody. Wabiska Mukwa, Anishinabek Mukwa. I wanted to do a quick little video. I've got my computer system up and running now. Hopefully, I can get some more videos now that the black fly season's here. I can stay inside to get away from the black flies. There was an interesting video I was watching the other day. Was someone comment that ASMIN was not a nation. I suggest anyone who is querying that comment look at the definition in the dictionaries of what a nation is. A nation is a group of people who have got some common interest or maybe dissimilar interests are coming together, work on a common goal, whether it's statehood or any other activity, they can be classified as a nation. It's always interesting that nationhood is defined by those who are basically at the United Nations. A state recognized nation or a nation recognized state, or however you want to play with the English language, is based on I've got an army, you've got an army, let's not fight, so we'll recognize each other. Recognition of who you are by a foreign power is in itself, because of the anthropogenetic racism, very racist, genocidal, all kinds of discussions on that, which I'm not going to get into today. And I find it very disconcerting that the colonial system coming from the British, when they got here in 1763, they brought their racism of slavery and every other aspect of racism to this country. And that was based on Carl Linnaeus in 1735, I believe, who said that Europeans who bred with Homo americanus, the offspring would be monsters. And so when the British got here, those learned people, and I've talked about this before, consider as subhuman. And when they looked at the doctrine of discovery, a rationale, if you have old Christians and new Christians, and if the indigenous people of a land didn't become new Christians, then you can do whatever you want with them. And that was the rationale for slavery and occupation and taking of the land illegitimately by brute force or sometimes by corporate embezzlement. Example, the Hudson Bay Company had a charter, a letter of marque to set up fur trading. They didn't have the land, but Canada bought the land from the Hudson Bay Company, so they bought stolen land to make Canada when they bought the Hudson Bay Rupert's Land tract. The difference between the early French and how they came into Canada, they realized that to work properly with the Indigenous people, they had to join with them and be friends with them. And Champlain, and if you look at the historical documents of Champlain, he said there'd be a new race of people, the blending of the French and the Indigenous people, and that became the Métis. Now, part of the trade relationships, the French and how they develop a colony, they didn't send copious amounts of people like the British into the territories that they're occupying. They tried to create a population base, and that was the basis of the baby bonus in my days, was from the old French, who were augmenting your income because most of the French were doing fur trade, gone for a year. And if they had a child every year, they got the same value, roughly, of what they would make on the fur trade as they would having one child from the French government. So they encouraged massive population boom by having babies. Now, it's very expensive to send people from France, women, as wives. So they took a lot of the half-breeds, the bastard children on Port Royal, sent in Quebec City. They did bring the filles de roi and the filles de mer over here, but that wasn't a large population of females. It was predominantly the interbreeding between the early French and the native population to create a new race of people called the Métis, or the Bastard Canadiens, because they were obviously bastards. Most of them weren't under the church, and when they came under the church, they changed their names to usually Marie or Madeleine or whatever. and they usually had um, the uh, the the banns in the Catholic Church read about 6 to 8 weeks after the baptismal of the child, where they changed the names so the records were expunged of the Aboriginal inheritance. Now, the French uh, understood that most Aboriginal communities, if you're not family, you're an enemy. And you don't trade with your enemy, you make them family. And that's well documented in all the historical, ethnological reports on early Aboriginal first contacts, etc., is that they like to bring new people into the community, increase the gene pool, so you're not, basically always with your own family, and that's your option for mating. They brought new people in. So the French realized that if you joined with, and if they're people, they're men, and the fur traders, if they joined with the native community and they had children in the native community, then you would have a trade relationship, and that kind of anchored the fur trade in North America, or at least in the Canadian or Canadian fur trade industry, is that you had those marriages with the children. And there's a lot of French Canadians that they have offspring. The fur traders, like the Brissets, there was two Brissets that went right across North America, and there's Brissets in pretty well every First Nation across the 49th parallel. And there's others. I just there's too many names to remember them all. The Trudeaus, the Trudeau is one. There's a lot of Trudeaus up on Wiki and up in Thunder Bay. There's Wikis of Delaron. That was a Count de Delaron, one of my family lines out of the up in Thunder Bay, whole Métis community up there. It's all fur trade related intermarriages to create Métis. Métis were just not developed in the Western provinces. It was the fur traders that went west, like my grandfather. I'm related to Louis Riel and Gabriel Demont. They're distant cousins of my grandfather, who was born in the late 1800s. So the relationship of the First Nation people with the early French was family. And that changed once the British came in with their colonial ideology of occupation, extermination, which was shown with the Beothuk in Labrador. They believed that there were savages to be exterminated, and that's in the very succinct book on all the historical records of the British writings in the 1800s and 1700s, the Beothuk book. Very good book that talks about the extermination. That's what the British basically wanted to do, is to exterminate, and that was the basis of all the residential schools and signing treaties, forcing them on very marginal land. And the history of Canada hasn't been talked about. But back to my original comment about what is a nation. A nation basically begins by a family, a clan, a community, many settlements, and enterprise, commercial, fur trade for one, fishing, hunting, growing crops, corn, tobacco. There was a lot of trade. The Nipissing Nation, which is part of my ancestry, traded the game and fish and other commodities to the Hurons, who gave them the corn and the tobacco. And so there's a lot of trade relationship. There's a very good report. It was actually a Canadian Film Board video of Kanata that they talked about the trade relationships all the way down to South America. And when I was in Kingston, the neighbor found, after a big storm, the original track from Montreal to Muddy York or Toronto, the original Aboriginal trail along the north shore of Lake Ontario. The bank gave way, and he found a moccasin. I think it's at Queen's University right now. The moccasin was dated maybe 600-700 years ago, and it had native rubber. Well, you only get rubber from the Amazon. So there was quite a trade relationship between South America, Central America, lower United States, and you'll find in any archaeological dig commodities that have been traded from the Pacific to the Atlantic and back and forth. So we did have trade. All our nations were nations. And the term First Nations is a term that was developed, I think, in 76 by a chief in, I think it was Manitoba or Saskatchewan, who coined the phrase First Nations because they're the First Nations. But the Métis were part of that, you know. There's no legal definition of a First Nation. It was just a term that was developed by a chief of an Indian band under the Indian Act who says, no, we're First Nations. And he took pride of his ancestry, and there were nations. So what is a nation? A nation is a group of people to determine that they are a nation. They don't need recognition by other people to be a nation. Now, if you're talking about a nation state under the UN, where you're talking about military compliances and all kinds of stuff and trade relations and a military that you see going on right now, well, that's a different nation definition. So there's many definitions of a nation. And when we talk about the ASMIN nation being a nation, we're a family, clan, community with trade relationships between many, many people, which is seen in the new AIN international treaty, kind of an update of the previous treaties of the 70s, which was called the Eagle and the Condor under the prophecy, which many nations signed. But that's going on right now. We're asserting our rights of Indigenous people. Currently, we have 7 land claims and trespass and land claims and demand to the appeals board of the Supreme Court. But obviously, the government doesn't want to deal with that, even though by their own laws they have to sign treaty with us. We're moving forward. We're doing a lot of stuff. Our elder chief is in Europe right now on a major international conference on innovative technology. I hope to get a really good update from him next week when he gets back from Europe. So we have always been the pillars of the economic society here of Canada with the fur trade, the forestry. I'll give an example. There's a book on Haliburton County. I forget what the title is. So they talked about when they brought all these Europeans into the Peter Robertson immigration back in 1860s and the 1880s, they got free land if they could clear it. Well, the problem was most of the people that came over, and I'm just doing a generality here, were people from the inner cities of Europe, which they're trying to get rid of, bring them over here, and they had to clear the land within a certain time, and they didn't know how to do it because they haven't. All the trees in, say, for example, England were pretty well decimated to rebuild all the big cities of England after it was burnt, and Birmingham. All the timber for Birmingham came from, I think, Chicago and northern Ontario when that burnt down. So they didn't know how to cut trees. So who did they get to cut the trees? Well, it says in the book, they brought all the Métis lumbermen from Quebec to cut all the trees under contract to these people in the Peterborough area. So the history is not well known. They don't teach this history, but it's there. You have to go to a lot of yard sales and get all the old books where they are not lying, but they're lying now in regards to the history of Canada and the development. Even after the Louis Howe Rebellion, as they call it, another derogatory comment, it was actually a defense of their lands. General Gordon, who was in Sudan, was surrounded, and they brought the Métis boatmen over to Sudan, go up the Nile to Sudan to try to save General Gordon when he was being attacked and he was decimated. They got there late, but it was the Métis boatmen that plied the Nile River to save this British general. Most people don't know this. The Métis people were a major pillar in the economic development of Canada, whether that was a good thing or not. It was just what was happening in the day. The fur trade was lucrative. Most of the men brought their native wives with them because the native wives knew how to survive off the land. But all our Indigenous people were very helpful to other people because we respected life. we respected the natural environment. But the Europeans obviously have never done that. We were the steward of the land. Even when I think it was Champlain was stuck on the shores, either Champlain or Cabot, I always get confused. They were stuck for winter, the boats didn't come back, and they were dying, and it was the native people came and gave them the medicines to survive. Also, there was a group called the gens de terre, basically people of the woods, right? But the funny thing was, they all could speak. These people that came out of the bush, that were all dressed up in many different railments of different Aboriginal communities. They came out of the woods to help Champlain and said, "Come on with us, guys. You can come with us and you can survive." They didn't go, but all these people spoke Spanish, Portuguese, English, and French. Well, where did they come from? This was at the beginning when there was supposed to be no one there. Well, it turned out that in that period when the British came over to go fishing, etc., they needed a full crew to come over here and get the resources that they're getting off the East Coast. But they only needed 3 or 4 guys to sail the boats back to England, so they just dumped all these sailors on the shore. And I'll say they're sailors because they learned how to sail on the journey over. But what it was is most of the sailors at that time were pressed out of the prisons, and they didn't want them back in England anyhow. So they left them on the shore, and they went in and joined with the natives. There's one early French person, they called him the King of Toulouse, and supposedly it's reported in history books, he had over 500 children. So we really joined with the native communities, and we're still part of the native communities. And the colonial people who are controlling Canada right now don't even know their own history. And that's something that hopefully will be brought to the forefront in the near future. We've been working a long time on our constitutional challenges with the Crown. They don't want to deal with us, but they're going to have to. It's been a long time that their laws have slowly changed, but the courts aren't implementing their own laws. They're not complying to them. It's very specific. The Royal Proclamation states that anyone who takes the lands and resources of Aboriginal people without signing treaty with them has to be brought to the Crown and be charged with treason. That was upheld in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was appended to the Constitution of Canada in 1982. And so if the government's not coming to sign treaty, then all those government officials are actually treasonous to the Crown. And it's interesting that the Crown will not relinquish Canada to a new Republic of Canada. The Crown is still controlling Canada through all kinds of very insidious means, but most of it is commercial enterprises. So the history of Canada is not what people think it is, and I really suggest that everybody does some research on the history of Canada, because it's really unique. And I'm not saying anything negative of Canada, it's just about the way it is, and that's the way it is. So we have been working on our constitutional challenges, both domestically and internationally, and we are working with Indigenous nations around the world, signing a treaty, essentially creating, under the Alliance of Indigenous Nations, an Indigenous United Nations to counter the UN United Nations, which is controlled by military supremacist countries, which has got the world in a really bad spot right now. So anyhow, I hope everybody is going to enjoy their summer, get out and enjoy the weather, because if you listen to all the climate changes, the world's ending in another 5 years, right? Listening to all these people. So enjoy your summer, and let the Creator bless you all, and enjoy every day for what you have, and give blessings to that effect. Thank you very much. Gichi Megwich, and talk to you later.